What are the ramifications of Martin Luther King Jr.'s views on economics? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation. Welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Okay, Richard, so this is Martin Luther King Jr. week where we celebrate the life of Martin Luther King Jr. Fantastic person in terms of leading America in the area of civil rights, very courageous position. Certainly, he was what we would call an enemy of the state because the state hated him for what he was doing, trying to end segregation, trying to get voting rights for blacks, and really risking his life and risking his freedom. He ended up in jail several times, but he always hung in there. I mean, he was a real inspiration in terms of courage and perseverance and steadfast conviction to what he believed was right. And in the midst of this battle for civil rights, he decides to take on the Vietnam War. And he realized that this is, all the same mentality that guides segregation, that is just this, what he called the U.S. government was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And it was, and it is. I mean, we know that it would be virtually impossible to find any regime that's a bigger purveyor of violence than the U.S. empire. And he took a lot of flack from the civil rights movement. Says, "Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this? You're muddying the waters on civil rights by bringing the war issue in." And he said, "No, it's all one and the same thing. We have to be doing this." And of course, he understood that they were conscripting a lot of the young poor black men who didn't have the money to go to college because you got a college deferment from going to Vietnam. So there was a large percentage of soldiers that were being sent over there through the draft that were black and to fight for freedom. Excuse me, I forgot to mention that. So King had the courage to take on both the civil rights battle and the Vietnam battle and became one of the real leaders in both movements. But the thing that I really want to concentrate on in this show, Richard, especially given your background in economics, is his economic position, because it really was a weak link in terms of what King stood for and was fighting for. And it was simply the fact that the guy did not understand, the principles of economics. I mean, I think if Martin Luther King Jr. had discovered Austrian economics and libertarianism, I think there's a huge chance that he would have been a tremendous leader in terms of educating everyone, but especially blacks, poor blacks, that the way you increase wealth and prosperity is through the free market. But what King was doing in the area of economics was, ironically, I don't think he saw this, he was looking to government to help the poor and equalize wealth and take from one group and give it to another group. And he obviously very sincere, as most progressives are, very sincere that this is the way you improve the plight of people, by passing laws, by seizing wealth of those who have it and giving it to others. But as we've learned time and again, this socialist concept causes lower standards of living. It reduces people's standard of living. It's the worst thing that can happen to poor people. And that, in fact, in a market economy, a free market economy, even though there's tremendous, vast disparities of wealth, everybody is better off, especially those at the bottom of the economic ladder. So the whole thing is rising, even if there's disparities of income. And that if King had understood that, I think today he would be not just a super standout, but a stupendous standout, where he's leading in the area of civil rights, the area of anti-war, anti-imperialism, anti-purveyor of violence, and an advocate of free market economics, Austrian economics. What do you think, Richard?
Well, I agree that if he had understood the free market approach, the basic principles of how a competitive market economy operates, he would have taken a very different slant and slight on things. Uh, what what you have been talking about, and I'm referring to, is that if you go through some of his speeches, some of the famous speeches or interviews that he did with the press, what you discover is that from a relatively early time in his civil rights activities, he had become sympathetic to and susceptible to um, the case for not just government redistribution of wealth, but what now euphemistically is referred to as democratic socialism. He had bought into the idea, and he expresses this in some of these speeches and correspondence and interviews, um, which you can get all online. It's not just you or I saying something. You can read his own words. Um, that capitalism is a system of exploitation. The capitalist system places profit before people. Uh, the market is one that is insensitive to the needs of those who are less well off. There's always the potential for a racist element to the way the market system operates. And given this, uh, what is needed is an enlightened economic system that places people before profits, the needs of the poor, rather than merely serving the comforts of the wealthy. And that this required a lot greater degree of government intervention, regulation, implicit planning, as well as the redistribution of wealth. And therefore, he failed to see that whether it be in the social arena, such as the segregation laws were separating people of different racial or ethnic backgrounds through the use of compulsion. Thou shalt not marry a person of a different race. Thou shalt not sit at the same counter of a restaurant with a person of a different race. Thou shalt not walk on the same sidewalk as a person of a different race, et cetera, et cetera. That the same thing applies to economics. If the government is going to even redistribute wealth, what you have to realize is that this is the government deciding who shall pay and who shall receive, and how much they'll receive. Uh, what wealth will be taken from some, and what housing will be given to others, and what kind of housing they will then be housed in, what type of jobs they'll be trained for, what type of opportunities will be given to them by the government. It's basically the government planning and directing your life and your standard of living, your employment and educational opportunities, your interfaces with others in the everyday affairs of production and consumption. And that once you do this, it is no different, though of a different quality perhaps by different benchmarks, as the segregation system. Thou shalt not work here, that's reserved for blacks or only for whites. Thou shalt go to this church, but not that church. Thou shalt sit in this restaurant, but not that restaurant. Well, then, is it any different if the government is saying, this is the wealth you'll have? This is the government housing you'll have. This is the type of government job training you'll receive for the types of employments that we think you're best fitted for, separate from how you feel about it. Basically, it is just another form of slavery, perhaps with a more velvet glove than the heavy hand of the old slavery of the American South and the segregation impositions, but still a velvet glove that has in its clutch the weapon of government coercion to confine you and make you conform to what the government has decided is your place in society, not the place that you'd like to find for yourself. And therefore, he was merely showing sympathy for and support for another system of coercion and compulsion, just different than the one that he found objectionable. That doesn't take away from his persona and his public face that assisted so much in bringing a higher consciousness to the American people against the indignities and the cruelties of segregation and racial attitudes to begin with. But it just shows that he was a victim, and I use that intentionally, a victim of the leftist and collectivist ideological currents that were increasingly present in the American academic and intellectual community in the middle and later decades of the 20th century. And that means that he failed to be the full advocate of liberty and freedom that he otherwise could have been.
Oh, you make some good points. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking that he was against this violence of the U.S. government overseas, but he could not see that the government has to initiate violence to get what he wanted the government to do, and that was help the poor. I mean, we often forget that the IRS is violence, or the threat of violence. If you don't pay your income taxes, they come for you. They prosecute you. They put you in jail. If you resist with force, they will meet force with force. Uh, and so when you have government helping people, it's an entire system based on the threat of violence. That if you don't help, if you don't pay your income taxes, you don't pay your fair share to help the poor, we will come and get you and we will put you in jail and we will do bad things to you. And it's fascinating that he could not see that he was turning to the same regime that he was decrying for being the greatest purveyor of violence in the world to use violence to help the poor. And I think it also made him a bigger enemy of the national security establishment because as a civil rights leader, J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA and the Pentagon, they all considered him to be a communist and an agent of the communists, a threat to national security. Well, the fact that he's over here advocating socialism too certainly doesn't help him out. And why he couldn't see a place like Cuba where the poor are in miserable shape. Now, I know that they've blamed, their economic straits on the embargo, and rightly so. The embargo is like a vice, along with socialism that squeezes the life out of people, which is one of the big reasons they never should have put the embargo on, because it gave the socialists and the communists an excuse to say, oh, without the embargo, socialism would be doing fantastic for the poor. Well, we both know it doesn't do fantastic. And Cuba is an example of that, even notwithstanding the embargo, is that you at the beginning of this system where you're taking these mansions belonging to the wealthy and these businesses, it's fun time because you've got a lot of wealth that's coming into the government coffers, and you're letting people populate the mansions that those rich families had and stuff. But over time, look what's happened. I mean, people are on the verge of starvation, and why he couldn't see that. And when you and I have talked about Austrian economics and the market economy for 36 years now here at FFF, one of the concepts we talk about, I'm not sure we've spent a whole lot of time on it, is mass production. And it's one of the real achievements of a capitalist free market system, and that's production for the masses. Because in the older days, the producers would orient to the wealthy, the royalty, and so forth. Along comes this market economy, and all of a sudden the poor are getting jobs in factories. They got a little bit of money to spend. Then the factories, the industries come into existence catering to them. So you got mass production of clothing and food and automobiles, and at a relatively cheap price, and prices were dropping the whole time. I mean, this is one of the greatest attributes of a market economy in terms of what it does for the poor. This mass production of shirts and trousers, and it's incredible, but we always take it for granted, Richard. We just say, oh, it's just with us. Well, it's not just with us. It's an actual outcome of a market economy, is how it benefits the poor and the people at the bottom of the economic ladder.
Well, he just put into the usual line that those on the left have used continuously to both rationalize and apologize for socialism in practice. Yes, the communists were a dictatorship, but look, they've given free education to everyone. There's free health care. Everyone has a roof over their head. The resources are used for everyone rather than just a few. The thing is, we want all of that, but we just want to see that it's a democratic socialism rather than the authoritarian or totalitarian socialism of Stalin's Russia. If only it's democratic, if it's more open, kinder and gentler, then the socialism that we're talking about is not only better, but it's more just and it's truly democratic. It represents a sharing for everyone. There's the full representation, not just in the voting booth, but on the table that everyone is eating from. And it's the misunderstanding that that is not how any socialist system can operate. Once the government takes over the means of production, either directly or indirectly through control and command, through the allocation of taking income from some and giving to other. And what's important to realize is that redistribution is never from Sam to Bob. It's from Sam to the government, and then the government deciding, well, both what Sam will keep and what Bob is going to get. It is the transfer of income and wealth to the political elite, the bureaucratic managers, to determine who's to get what, how much, where, and when. It's just another set of overseers and masters. And the tragedy is that whether it be Martin Luther King or many of the people who voted for the new mayor of New York City or in Seattle as well, they just don't understand this. If we could only have the good things and not the bad things. I have to say is that when I was traveling in the Soviet Union in its last years, and I would talk to people, whether they be Russian economists or intellectuals or some guy driving the taxi cab, virtually all of them did not want the existing system anymore. They hated the dictatorship. They hated the special elite that with their favors and privileges in the Communist Party, that they virtually to a person, they detested the KGB. You know, the threat of a knock on the door and being taken away just because of what you said or you wrote or who you interacted with and why. But they basically wanted socialism with goodies. That's what they wanted. They wanted the same government guaranteed housing, the same government guaranteed job, the same guaranteed health care. They just wanted it to be with a human face, to be done better, more efficiently, more fairly, and more democratically. In other words, give me the socialist goodies, just don't tell me what I can read and write. Now, I'm slightly exaggerating, but not much. And this is what these people are talking about it here. Yes, it's such a great vision that everyone will have what only goes to a few now. All we need to have it is to be representing what everybody wants, not just a few, and for us to be able to say what we want and read what we want, et cetera, et cetera. And that is the delusion and the danger of this mythology of a democratic socialism.
Well, and there have been Black leaders over the years that have recognized the horrors of the welfare state and have actually, advised Blacks, don't go down this road.
Right.
That your best route is independence,
Mhm.
starting a business or working for a business, saving your money. Don't get on welfare because they'll lock you in for the rest of your life. And to me, really, Richard, it's sort of like a form of slavery. It's a sophisticated form of slavery that they put you on the dole and then they control you. It's a matter of control. And I saw this in Laredo, my hometown. They had public housing projects like, in the rest of the country. And I was practicing law, and a guy comes in to hire me because they had seized his car, the city had, and a credit company. And I was asking him how the public housing worked where he was. And he says, well, it's set up so that if you can only make a certain amount of money. And if you reach that point, they throw you out. Well, then you have to go buy a house or rent a house where you may not have the savings. So it inevitably just locks a lot of people in. It says, well, I don't have that, so I'll just stay here indefinitely the rest of my life, where they control you. And so you've had the Black leaders that have pointed this out to Blacks. Let me give you another example of this effect is the minimum wage. You see, it seems so easy, and I'm sure King called for an increase in the minimum wage. Standard policy, right? Okay, real easy. Hey, man, just have a law, raise the minimum wage. Well, okay, why raise it to only $10 an hour? Why not $100 an hour, $1,000 an hour? If it was that easy, there would be no poverty in the world. Every nation on earth could just simply make the minimum wage $100 an hour. But what they end up doing is they lock out of the labor market the poor, the people whose labor is valued less than that artificial minimum. And that, in this case, means a lot of black teenagers. If you look at the unemployment rate about black teenagers, it's always higher, significantly higher than the rest of the country. Why? Because the marketplace is putting a value that's less than that artificial minimum. And so where are those black teenagers supposed to go? They're locked out. So where do they go? They go into the drug trade oftentimes, or they try to figure out some welfare program where they're there the rest of their lives. Or let's say a guy in a black neighborhood wants to start a business, and he tells all the teenagers there, come and work for me. I'll give you stock in my business. I don't have a lot of capital. Come over here and work at a really low wage, but I'll give you stock. He can't do that because the law prohibits him from hiring people at less than the minimum. And so this system that so many liberals support in the name of helping the poor actually ends up being a huge attack on the poor.
Well, I think, you had said something towards the beginning that if given the reputation and stature Martin Luther King had because of his courage and forthrightness in defending civil liberties, in the sense of ending segregation and attempting to undermine racist attitudes, his opposition to the war. If only he had understood free market economics as well. I fear that if he had decided to take on the interventionist welfare state from a free market perspective, his reputation would have pummeled. Let me give an example of this. And I've written about him. The article was also posted on the FFF website a few years ago by George Schuler. He was a black journalist, author. He started breaking into the white audience of readership by becoming a favorite of H.L. Mencken in the American Mercury in the late 1920s. But throughout the 1920s and 1930s and 40s, he was an outspoken, eloquent, uncompromising opponent of segregation and racism, ridiculing, condemning it, satirizing white attitudes, but always from a non-socialist perspective. He said what the black man wants is the rights of the Declaration of Independence, a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness without the government getting into the way. He even was an officer with the NAACP in the 1940s. In the post-war period, he was a staunch anti-communist. Nothing ever came out of Moscow that he liked. Okay, he was a staunch anti-communist. And obviously he had fought for the idea of ending racial inequalities through government. But he got on the bad side of the civil rights movement. How so? And by the way, he was an editorialist for the largest black newspaper in the United States for over 25 years, headquartered in Pittsburgh. But he started challenging two things. And the two things were, what replaces segregation? And his answer was the free society. And his disagreements with the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s was not their call for the abolition of segregation laws, that is, the forced separation of members of different races who might want to interact, but his opposition to forced integration. He said the free society is one that is free of both compulsory separation or compulsory forcing together. You have to rely upon the slow forces of social improvement in developing better people. And that he viewed the free market this way. He was an advocate of free enterprise, a critic of socialism. And the result is that certainly beginning in the late 1950s, but in the 1960s, he was locked out of the civil rights movement. He was condemned that leading black newspaper in Pittsburgh dropped him. All of the leading newspapers that would run his articles, mainstream newspapers, wouldn't run his pieces anymore. Once he got on the bad side of the civil rights movement because of his opposition to forced integration and his advocate of free enterprise in the way we would talk about it, with the result, he was left with the John Birch Society publication, American Opinion, as the only publication that would regularly publish him. He almost had a monthly article with them for a good period of years. He was a heroic individual. He's one of my heroes, my personal heroes on questions of race and freedom. I wrote an article about him. It can be found on the FFF website. You posted it there. And I highly recommend learning about him. I quote from a lot of his articles from his lifetime and about him. And I believe that is also reflected in how the media and the elite Black leadership community has treated other Black free market economists, such as Walter Williams or Thomas Sowell. They are invisible. They have no place. They're not referenced. They're not quoted. They're not assigned. They're not even, their names are not even mentioned. They are exiled to outside the acceptable and the polite within the Black civil rights leadership and community. Why? Because they challenge the gravy train of the welfare state and the interventionist state upon which so much of the established civil rights elite leadership is dependent, upon which their money and jobs and supporters come from. And I fear that if King had really shifted into a free market view, matching his anti-war and his anti-segregation stance, he would have slowly but surely received a lot more criticism within the Black community and the intellectual mass media than he ever had. People had accused him of plagiarism. People had accused him of not living up to his own ethical standards of affairs outside of his marriage, all of which seems to have been true. But that came from critics of him in the white community. No one in the Black community rose those issues under the rug because he's our hero. Right? Speak no evil of the face of the good cause. But if he had started advocating the free market views, the knives would have come out. And I really believe that.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I mean, of course, we never know, but when he took on the war issue suddenly and unexpectedly, the knives came out within the civil rights movement. I said, "You're hurting our movement. What are you doing?" And he hung in there. He says, "It's all the same thing." And I don't know what the final consequence of it was. I don't know how much longer he lived after that before he was assassinated. But my hunch is that he convinced a lot of them that it is all one and the same thing. That a lot of the people in the Black community began opposing the war because of that stand he took. So I don't know if it's necessarily tried. There's no question. I agree with it. The knives would have come out, but I wonder how effective those knives would have been if he'd have been a really effective advocate because of the high esteem that people held him in. And another issue is, he and Malcolm X had a strained relationship, but near the end there, they were coming together, especially on civil rights. I just find a hard time believing that Malcolm X would have criticized him for not calling for government taking care of people, because I don't think Malcolm X wanted to have anything to do with the U.S. government. Um, but it's an interesting thing. I mean, if King had made the case that you and I make about, the causes of wealth, you and I have talked about the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's work of what is it that causes wealth, and if King had been talking like that instead of what are the causes of poverty, what are the causes of wealth, what do we need to do in this society to increase wealth for everybody, prosperity for everybody, and then talked about the importance of savings and capital and productivity. And I don't know, Richard, I think he might have influenced a lot of people in our direction, but you make a good point. I mean, Walter Williams is Black, very persuasive economist, and I don't see that he got a large I mean, I think his large following was mostly among white libertarians. I
The
don't
same with Thomas Sowell among
still the
libertarians and
same
some
thing.
conservatives.
Yeah, I don't know. Now, I will say that I think if you did a survey of the American people, I think blacks, generally speaking, would have a better handle on foreign policy from our libertarian perspective as this huge racket, deadly racket, interventionism of the US government, as compared to your white middle class person living in the suburbs that automatically buys into this nonsense in Venezuela and the killing of people in the high seas and so forth, and all these ICE raids and stuff. I think there'd be more sympathy among blacks generally for what's going on with migrants here in this country at the hands of ICE and so forth. But there is that blind spot among blacks and whites, middle class and so forth, on this issue of the market economy and Austrian economics, and what is it that causes wealth, and how interventionism and socialism hurt the poor. And um, but I think that's a real viable market for us as libertarians, where people at the bottom of the economic ladder, there's a lot of people suffering right now, not just blacks, but whites. This affordability issue is very real. They're getting taxed to death. They're getting, inflated to death by the Federal Reserve. It's the whole thing is really crunching Americans, and I think they are right to consider this lesson. So even if King didn't do it, we might be at a time where people might be questioning this whole system. At least I certainly hope
Well,
so.
like yourself, I've often thought that the case for liberty should be most attractive to those who are most the victims of state power and state control. King was certainly right to emphasize the segregation of the South. He was right to talk about the injustice of conscription and people against their will being sent to fight wars that they might neither understand nor agree with. Uh, and it certainly would have been a compliment to that if he had made the free market case. And I have bemoaned the fact that when I have often attended either libertarian events, I mean, both big L and little L libertarian events, as well as conservative events, by which I mean whether they're Republican or not conservatives, but not conservatives who have enough overlap with libertarians that they share a variety of the libertarian values. How few members of the Black community are often in attendance of these things. Because certainly the case for ending the interventionist welfare state should have the greatest appeal of freeing from this dependency those who or whose community members have suffered from it most egregiously and for longest. As Thomas Sowell has documented, uh, before the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s, uh, poverty and income levels were rising very noticeably in the Black community from the time of the end of the Second World War to the early 1960s. But that once the Civil Rights Acts were passed, and by which I mean not a banning of the segregation laws in the South, but the growth of welfare state dependency, Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty, war on racism in the sense of redistributive handouts, that in fact the rate of improvement, economic and income improvement in the Black community dramatically slowed down. So that in fact improvements were occurring before the enlightened welfare state being accelerated and expanded, and could be again if the government would just get out of the way.
Yeah, in fact, your point about segregation and integration is, I think, very important. We addressed this, as you might recall, our very first year at FFF's existence, where we talked about anti-discrimination laws, and we pointed out that, and I've pointed out over the years, that the reason that Jim Crow came into existence in the first place, segregation and so forth, was because blacks were outcompeting whites in the marketplace, and because blacks were integrating with whites on a natural basis. If Alabama naturally was going to be a separate society, you wouldn't have needed laws requiring segregation. It would have just happened naturally. It was the fact that integration was happening naturally and blacks were prospering, outcompeting whites in many businesses, that's what required the segregation. And that, as you pointed out, and as I pointed out in this essay, I think it was in October of 1990, our very first year, I wrote an essay called Racism, Control, and Rock and Roll, where I was showing that, hey, in the music industry, the rock and roll area, there was natural integration taking place, much to the chagrin of white bigots like Buddy Holly. If you see the movie, the Buddy Holly story, where Buddy Holly is up there playing the Apollo Theater in New York City, and just a fantastic scene where everybody's gasping, including every black in the audience, that this white act is playing the Apollo Theater. And Buddy Holly says, well, "We're just as surprised as y'all are," but they loved him. And Elvis is a white man sounding like a black man. That, in other words, the market economy not only raises people's standard of living, especially the poor, it breaks down racial barriers. And I think that would have been a great argument for King to be making while he was
Well,
fighting for
at the
civil
same time, it overlaps certainly with King's years as well, was apartheid in South Africa. Walter Williams once wrote a book called South Africa's War Against Capitalism. Notice that? Against capitalism. Because he was saying, as others had said, that the apartheid laws, that is, the laws that excluded where black Africans could live against white South Africans, what occupations they could compete in, what jobs they could be hired for, and where, and at what pay, were all instances of the demonstration that if not for those those apartheid laws, members of the black South African community were very effectively competing against rivals who happened to be white in businesses, employments, communities in which people were starting to live together. And in fact, it required the heavy hand of the state to intervene to impose these rigid separation laws in the name of certain white segments of the population who either just psychologically hated having to associate with blacks on an intimate everyday basis, or were afraid of the competition that blacks could offer them in the marketplace. So if not for the state's intervention, whether it be in South Africa or the southern states here before the laws of the 1960s ending segregation, the natural process would have been a coming together without the animosity, without the violence, without the resistance. Because without the segregation laws in the South, a person might condemn you for hiring blacks or associating with blacks or having blacks go to your church or something, but they couldn't stop you, because for them to stop you would have then required the state to come in and protect your right to your life, your liberty, and your right of freedom of association. So is the failure to see the principles of liberty in these avenues of human relationships that has stained far too much and continues to stain far too much of our history and our contemporary life.
Yeah, it destroys the concept of liberty. I mean, it's better to nudge people toward right behavior in the marketplace than to use the coercion and the violence of the state. I think before we wrap things up, we ought to mention that Walter Williams, who, by the way, I'm sure most of our audience knows Walter Williams, but just in case they don't, a professor of economics at George Mason University, one of the best economics professors ever. He was head of the department there. And another great book that he wrote, Richard, The State Against Blacks. Fantastic book.
And I would say the same about Thomas Sowell. He has spent a life writing about race and affirmative action and ethnic government policies, both in the United States and around the world. And he's done yeoman's work challenging all the false facts and the cliches that those on the left, the collectivists, the socialists, the interventionists, the welfare statists, have attempted to justify their heavy-handed use of the government on all these matters.
On that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you, Richard. As always, I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you all for tuning in. As always, thank you for your great support of FFF. Richard, look forward to talking to you next week.
Until next time.